the Russians left Kherson last week. I've been pulling out for the last few weeks out of Kherson. There's, although up to 110 to 115,000 civilians evacuated to the Russian side, it would appear that some of the Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian population in Kherson are seeking out revenge and are looking for people who collaborated with the Russians or even just speak the Russian language. These are videos that we've seen time and again since last March coming out from Ukraine of people being taped to poles and trees by sometimes members of the militia, the Ukrainian militia, sometimes just members of the public, but people are left there. The temperature is dropping, things are getting colder, and I'm just concerned that once again people will be left to die while they're strapped to these poles because they speak Russian or because they access Russian services before the Russians pulled out.
Ми ж не знаємо, коли це був перший день. Я робила Максиму Івановичу Литвиненко. Ви повинні знати.
За це, що перекрасився, коротше, він совкого селецького зя.
Так, він прийшов на холодильник, я пішла на холодильник, він підходить до мене і спрашує.
Again, allegedly, this is footage. And again, we can't confirm this, but this is the other side of the story that we're not being shown in mainstream media, and somebody's got to show it. But this footage is allegedly of Russian-speaking civilians in Kherson who have been arrested and rounded up and accused of working with the Russians. God only knows their fate.
Орк в оригинальной упаковке. Живой, сука! Живой, бля, закрывайте. Нахуя ему. Нету.
This is a video circulating and doing the rounds at the moment of Ukrainian forces. Porks, I think, recognizes this guy from another video as well. And they have what is described as an orc. And this is what they call Russians, orcs. And he looks quite like an orc himself. But they have an orc in his packaging, as they called it. So they basically have him in a coffin. And this is a living human being that they're clearly torturing psychologically at a minimum. Lots of videos have come out over the last few weeks, in particular, of Russian POWs being summarily executed by Ukrainian soldiers. Although every effort is made to deny the videos, even the New York Times this week confirmed the validity of one of the more recent videos in which 11 Russians who were convinced by Ukraine to come out of a basement, surrounded, that to be treated respectfully. They were then told to lie on the ground on their bellies, and they were shot in the back of the head. I've watched 6 or 7 similar videos over the last 48 hours. I was considering, and we were considering, whether we'd show them in the show, and we just can't. We'd be censored, and we'd have the show pulled down straight away. It really is horrific. And some of the most disgusting aspects of this is the fact that the victims are then being inverted to being the perpetrators in some of the Western media, until eventually it becomes incontrovertible that it's Ukraine doing this. But the idea that, you know, the victims are then labeled as the perpetrators in these types of war crimes is to me particularly sickening. What do you think of this, Padraig?
I'm quite skeptical of all media content that comes along. I think it should be. I think it's healthy to be. When you spoke about the one there about the New York Times verified it, I had seen that video earlier in the week, and it had gone off shot before it showed the actual shootings, you know. And I said to myself, is that staged? And then later in the week, you're getting it verified from several sources. So we should always be skeptical on what we see, but we should never assume that they're not factual because they haven't come from the big corporate media, you know. So
I think the video that you saw actually purposely had it removed because maybe the fear that it wouldn't be shown around. I've seen it. I also saw some footage earlier today, quite clearly, walking around the room where there were lots of Russian soldiers lying down and putting a gun to their head, firing pieces of scalp, skull, blood, all flying into the air each time that they do it. So I have no doubt that it's real. It's very, very real.
And the war crimes, like there is bad war crimes as has happened in any other generation, and there is the great and good of the virtue signaling and West is all behind one faction, and it seems to be a faction that is committing war crimes.
It's just it's horrific, and I just don't know what the end game is going to be. There was a poll taken in terms of Ireland has a neutrality enforcement procedure called the triple lock, which ensures that Ireland remains neutral, it doesn't get sucked into war. There was a poll taken recently. Paul, if you want to talk about that poll result.
So yeah, this poll was posted in the journal from today from there. So just preceding it, it was titled up as Minister for Foreign Affairs Simon Coveney has said that moving away from the triple lock system will be a sensible change, with a motion put forward at the Fine Gael Ardèche to require only government and Dáil approval. However, coalition partner and Green Party leader Minister Eamon Ryan said the current system works for the country, while Sinn Féin has also pushed back against the idea, saying it would threaten Irish neutrality. And this is the poll that was carried after that short few words. And the poll showing you, like, there's some significant sample poll, like you've got nearly 5,000 people saying no, don't make any change, leave the triple lock as it is. And that's the majority on that chart. You've then got another section that's saying yes, but I mean the question is quite limited. Like, so they're saying yes, that would be to scale it down to 2 checks before they could move on assisting militarily. But that's not to say that they want to discard neutrality in any way, shape, or form. But this, to me, is still a strong indication that the Irish public do not want any change to their status of neutrality, which, as we know, is happening anyway.
There have been significant decisions made on our behalf and without our consultation in terms of our neutrality over the last while. Some people would argue that we've never really been neutral. It's all just a show. But we've certainly been more neutral in the past than we are now. Those figures are still significant because there's been a massive propaganda campaign to encourage us to abandon our neutrality over the last while, both in terms of pulling our emotional strings with regards to Ukraine, also our emotional strings in terms of trying to fill us with fear that we're in some way in danger ourselves from some kind of a ridiculous Russian threat, which really doesn't exist as far as I can see. Here's some headlines in relation to that further assault on our neutrality. Minister for Foreign Affairs backs change to triple lock as sensible. Ireland backs push for joint EU military procurement. The Fine Gael Ardèche will debate a motion calling on Ireland to provide anti-armour weaponry to Ukraine, a measure previously rejected by the government. There really is a big push here, isn't it, Patrick?
Major push. We're talking about neutrality, and they try and make the distinction in governments, for successive governments over a number of years, that there is this ability to differentiate military neutrality and political neutrality, and it's a way of just totally eroding neutrality. Like, we should it both go together, in my view. But like, even in the context of saying we're militarily neutral, look at the headlines. Like, you know, we're talking about joint military procurement. We're talking about anti-armour weaponry. Now, I did drop in there as well, just that there has been a clarification, I think, in the last day or two, that the government has indicated that a motion on Ireland remaining militarily neutral won't be opposed by the government. So this doesn't mean that Fine Gael is going to get their way on this right now, but you can see certainly where it's going. There's just something else I wanted to make you aware of as well. There was some parliamentary questions submitted from the Irish Neutrality Campaign Group, and they were submitted through a TD in the Dáil, and there were some questions answered and they replied back. So I'll just give you the information on that. So in response to a question asked whether Ireland adheres to the 1907 Hague Convention on Neutrality, the Department of Foreign Affairs provided the following response. Ireland's long-standing policy of neutrality is characterised by non-membership of military alliances and means that we do not participate in common or mutual defence arrangements. As I have noted previously, our policy of military neutrality continues to inform our active approach towards peace support operations and crisis management, and our contributions to conflict resolution and peace building. Ireland is not a party to the Hague Convention respecting the rights and duties of neutral powers and persons in cases of war on land, and there are no plans for it to become one. Incorporation of its provisions into domestic law accordingly does not arise. Now, that was a surprise to me, because what we're basically saying there is that, number one thing that sticks out to me, like mutual defence pacts, like what's PESCO exactly, and like that we aren't actually affiliated. to the Hague Convention, which was created before the state was formed. But as a nation that has stuck very resolutely to their neutrality, like, why wouldn't you be adhering to the terms of that?
But in reality, that statement that you just read out, if you had actually just read out blah, 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 you would have been just as informed, because it's just bullshit, really, isn't it? We know that, especially over the last 5 years in particular, we have been intensively being integrated into the developing and growing EU army and military machine that has been created there through, as you said, PESCO, but other arrangements as well, and that those arrangements are then being aligned with NATO. I think it was yourself that made the point earlier that NATO, the majority of EU members are in fact NATO members, and so the idea that their policies would in some way not be aligned is ridiculous in itself. I spoke to John Moran, who is quite a prolific commentator on the Ukraine conflict. He ran the foreign desk for the Irish press for a number of years, and he's quite astute and he's quite outspoken and honest, and one of the only journalists that are being honest and outspoken in terms of what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, and what's happened in the past, and what probably will happen into the future. So I'm going to run that interview now, and we'll come back straight after that. Thanks for joining us today, John. You're one of the more prolific and outspoken voices on Twitter and other social media from Ireland with regards to what's really happening in Ukraine, and trying to create some kind of a balance within the narrative. And it's something that's quite risque to do in this day and age. So I and others thank you for doing that. I've invited you on just to hit you up with a few questions in relation to try to get your gauging and your opinion on where we're at with Ukraine at the moment. The first question I have for you, John, is, although we're inundated with news of Russian atrocities from Ukraine, there appears to be little evidence, actual hardcore evidence of those atrocities by Russia, but rather just statements coming from Ukrainian officials claiming that X, Y, or Z has happened in the future. But there does seem to be growing evidence of Ukrainian military atrocities being committed against Russian POWs and individuals who have surrendered, and even members of the public at times. What is your take on the way the media is reporting alleged Russian atrocities and actual Ukrainian atrocities?
Well, when I was working on the Irish press foreign desk back in the late 80s and 90s, there were a number of wars going on at the same time. Yugoslavia was breaking up. The Soviet Union was falling apart. The South African apartheid situation was collapsing. There was numerous wars that you didn't know where to be looking. So you were taking information coming in all the time about all these different wars. But you were getting a number of different sources with different viewpoints. What's completely different here is, for the first time ever in a conflict, one side has been completely cancelled. That has never happened before. Now, as a journalist, that offends me hugely, because I have to ask, if you have to stop the other side being heard, what exactly are you hiding? So that was my starting point, and I was very, very angry about the one-sidedness of all the news media. Anything Zelensky said or the press office in Kiev handed out, they would dutifully reproduce. When Zelensky was screaming about Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, saying that the Russians were bombing it, that's what was being reported. It's a total and utter lie.
And your take on that, just to confirm on that issue alone, what you're saying is, and the evidence has been presented, that it is the Ukrainian side that is actually bombing not only that particular nuclear power plant, which is the largest one in Europe, to my understanding, but there's another nuclear facility more north of what some people claim to be Western Russia now, and some people claim to be Eastern Ukraine. But there is another plant that Ukrainian forces have bombed, I believe, the waste management facility of another nuclear plant, and possibly are almost using that nuclear power plant as a form of blackmail, to blackmail the Russians that if you don't do what we want, we are going to create a nuclear disaster in parts of our own country, that they're willing to go that far. So that's the extent of it. You've been, as I say, reporting these things. And I noticed that on Twitter today, you put out some